Okay, I've called this video "Which is the greatest of the Tudor monarchs?" because there's a case for at least three of them being the greatest of the Tudor dynasty. Um, Now, a lot of people would probably start with Henry VIII and say, yes, he's the greatest because of the huge impact he had on British history. This is the king that broke the English church away from the control of the Pope for the first time. This is the king that dissolved the monasteries in the 1530s, which has caused massive social change in this country. And this is the monarch, of course, that is remembered for having 6 wives and having 2 of his wives executed and so forth. Now, I would discount Henry VIII from the race, because yes, he had 6 wives. Yes, he was a larger-than-life figure who could turn on a whim and have his right-hand men executed like Thomas Cromwell in 1540. But being a larger-than-life character and executing your wives, to me, isn't something that you can kind of judge as great. Certainly not killing your wives. In terms of greatness, we're talking about who has the most long-standing positive impact on the development of British history, and who is the most successful monarch in terms of what they themselves are trying to achieve. Now, on the case of the latter point, who's the greatest of the Tudors in terms of what they're themselves trying to achieve, then there's a strong case to be made for Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, being the greatest of the Tudor monarchs. Because, of course, Henry VII is the one that established the dynasty in the first place by winning the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485 and taking the throne by conquest from Richard III, who was killed in the battle. And not only did Henry VII seize the throne, but he also managed to keep himself on the throne and leave the throne to his successor when he died in 1509, which is something that the 3 previous monarchs had failed to do. Nobody would have probably expected Henry VII to last the length of time that he did, because there were many people with a better claim to the throne than Henry, such as Elizabeth of York, who was the sister of the princes in the Tower, and also the children of George, Duke of Clarence, Edward IV's brother, and there were other Yorkist claimants as well. But of course, what Henry VII did is he made some very wise moves. First and foremost, he married Elizabeth of York, the sister of the princes in the Tower, so that any of their children would be the heirs of both York and Lancaster, which Henry VIII was. And Henry VII also invented the famous Tudor rose emblem, as an enduring symbol of the Tudor dynasty. And he was very lucky in that the main plots against him were not really by, in my view, convincing Yorkist claimants. There was the Lambert-Simnel conspiracy in 1487 and the Perkin-Warbeck conspiracy, which lasted from about 1491 to 1497, when he was captured after the Cornish Rebellion. But those people were pretenders. It's unless you believe some of the more controversial historiography about them, they were not genuine Yorkist claimants. So I think we can say that Henry VII has a good case for being the greatest Tudor monarch. The problem is that towards the end of his reign, he was becoming incredibly unpopular. As Thomas Penn called him in his excellent book, he'd become the Winter King, because his reign was seen as by them very oppressive. He had spies in all the nobles' houses. He got 75% of the nobility under bonds and recognisances. And most people, I think, were glad to see the back of him when he died in 1509, and he was succeeded by his 17-year-old son. So, there are positives and negatives about Henry's reign, but he certainly did establish the dynasty. I think we can probably discount Edward VI as the greatest of the Tudor monarchs, because Edward VI died as a boy of about 15. And we never really got to see fully what he would be like, although we get an idea that he would be a very fervent Protestant king who would have carried out further sweeping Protestant inclined religious reforms. But of course, his reign was one where England was ruled first of all by the Duke of Somerset, then the Duke of Northumberland. And it wasn't very successful foreign policy wise during that period. We ended up failing to get Mary Queen of Scots to marry Edward. In fact, she went over to France and married the son of the King of France instead. We also lost Boulogne, one of our remaining French territories during that reign, and it only lasted for 6 years. So we can discount Edward, I think. What about Mary the First? Well, a fair few people might think that Mary was the greatest of the Tudor monarchs. She certainly restored the Catholic Church to England in the sense of full Catholicism and the power of the Pope after the reign of Edward, which has seen England really become Protestant, certainly from above, if not below. But the problem with Mary is, of course, her reputation is stained by the Marianne burnings, which we can argue the extent of, but it may have been, around 300 people burned at the stake in the space of only 3 years for their faith, including the Oxford martyrs, of course. And Archbishop Cranmer was burned, even though he recanted his faith. And most people would also say that her decision to marry Philip II of Spain was a disaster because it subjugated England's foreign policy to the interests of Spain and dragged us into a Spanish war by the end of the reign. And she was also unlucky, I suppose, in the sense that the economy wasn't doing well under her reign, and there were a series of bad harvests that led to mass starvation across areas of the countryside. Personally, I'd go for Elizabeth I as the greatest of the Tudor monarchs, the last of the Tudors. Why? Because the reforms that she made have lasted. So whereas you'd had this period of chopping and changing, religious direction under the previous 3 monarchs, what Elizabeth did is in 1559 established the Church of England, which had a via media approach. That is, it had bits of Catholicism within its doctrines, but then huge amounts of relatively mild Protestantism. And she successfully dealt with challenges both from the Puritans and the Catholics throughout her reign. Despite being excommunicated by the Pope in 1570, she managed to keep a lid on the missionary priests coming into England, and she managed to stop too much of a Catholic problem, in the sense that only 7% of the population were recusants. That's people staying out of the Church of England. And as for the Puritans, she regularly slapped them down in a number of incidents, such as the Strickland affair, the Field affair, the Grindal affair, the Whitgift affair, where periodically Protestants would cause her difficulties and she would keep a lid on them. Also, I think Elizabeth has a claim to be the greatest because, of course, of the Spanish Armada, and the fact that we saw off what was a serious potential threat to the country in 1588, and also because she proved that a female monarch, she was only the second female monarch after Mary I, she proved that a female monarch could manage some quite ambitious and quarrelling ministers, with strong personalities, people like William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was a right-hand man for much of the reign, and then his son Robert Cecil. Characters like Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who she may or may not have been in love with at one time, and of course Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, towards the end of the reign, who she ends up executing. There were difficulties in Elizabeth's reign. I mean, one of the problems is she was very indecisive, in my view, about whether to execute Mary Queen of Scots or not, and had to be essentially tricked by her ministers into doing it in 1587. after being very reluctant to do that. And of course, the problem with Mary, Queen of Scots, is she was a Catholic and she was the heir to the throne after Elizabeth. And therefore, while she lived, she was a potential focus for plots and rebellions, such as the Babington plot and so forth. So it did make sense to remove her. But apart from her reluctance on issues like that, I think we can say that in terms of lasting reform and a lasting impact on this country, I would say Elizabeth I is the greatest of the Tudor monarchs. Thanks for listening.